Welcome to a story from American Scandal Report by Scoob. Today we're diving deep into one of the most explosive chapters in American civil rights history, the rise and dramatic fall of Malcolm X within the Nation of Islam. This isn't just a story about religion or politics. This is a tale of power, betrayal, and the dangerous game of challenging the very institution that made you. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and for the next hour, we're going to unpack one of the most complex relationships in modern American history, the bond between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam that elevated him to greatness, then tried to destroy him when he became too powerful to control. To understand how Malcolm X became both the Nation of Islam's greatest asset and most dangerous threat, we need to go back to the beginning. Picture this: a young boy watching his world crumble around him, not understanding that every tragedy was shaping him into a future revolutionary. Malcolm's father, Earl Little, wasn't just any preacher. He was a man on fire with Marcus Garvey's vision of black nationalism. Serving as president of the Omaha branch of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, Earl preached economic independence, black pride, and the radical idea of returning to Africa. But when you challenge white supremacy in 1920s America, you paint a target on your back. Earl's death cast a shadow that would haunt the Little family for generations. With their patriarch gone, the family spiraled into poverty and despair. Malcolm's mother, Louise, cracked under the pressure, her mental health deteriorating until the state stepped in and scattered the children like leaves in the wind. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Despite being bounced between foster homes, despite losing everything, Malcolm showed promise. He was popular, talented, intelligent. But then came the moment that changed everything: a single conversation with a white teacher that would plant the seeds of his future radicalism. Picture 8th grade Malcolm, bright-eyed and ambitious, telling his English teacher he wanted to be a lawyer. The response? "That's not realistic for a nigger. Why don't you think about carpentry instead?" In that moment, something died in young Malcolm, his faith in white America's promises of equality and opportunity. This wasn't just discouragement. It was a systemic crushing of dreams that pushed Malcolm toward the streets, toward crime, and eventually toward prison. But here's the twist: that prison cell would become his university, and the Nation of Islam would become his salvation. Prison was supposed to break Malcolm, but instead it remade him. When he encountered the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, it was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve his entire life. The Nation of Islam offered something revolutionary: a complete inversion of white supremacist ideology. Where white society called black people inferior, the nation proclaimed black superiority. Where Christianity had been used to justify slavery, the nation rejected it entirely. Where white America preached integration, the nation demanded separation. For Malcolm, this wasn't just religion, it was revolutionary psychology. The nation taught that white people were literally devils, created by an evil scientist named Yaqub 6,000 years ago. It sounds fantastical now, but for a man who had watched white supremacy destroy his family, who had been told his dreams were unrealistic, this theology made perfect sense. Elijah Muhammad became the father figure Malcolm had lost. The nation became the family that had been torn apart. And Malcolm X, that X representing his lost African name, became the man who would transform from student to teacher, from follower to leader. But here's what made Malcolm dangerous from the very beginning. He was too smart, too charismatic, too effective at taking the nation's message to the masses. While other ministers preached to small congregations, Malcolm was about to turn the Nation of Islam into a national phenomenon. Let me paint you a picture of transformation that's almost impossible to believe. In 1952, when Malcolm X was released from prison, the Nation of Islam was essentially a Chicago cult, with maybe 400 members scattered between Chicago and Detroit. By 1961, under Malcolm's leadership, membership had exploded to over 50,000 people across major American cities. This wasn't gradual growth, this was a revolution in recruitment and public relations. Malcolm understood something that the old guard nation leadership didn't: the power of media in the modern age. His relationship with the black press was masterful. When the New York Amsterdam News started covering those Muslims as headline news, it sparked conversations on every street corner in Harlem. Malcolm contributed a weekly column called God's Angry Men and coordinated for Elijah Muhammad to have his own regular feature. This wasn't just journalism, It was propaganda warfare for black minds and hearts. But Malcolm's real genius was in human resources. He had an uncanny ability to spot potential in the most overlooked members of society. Take Joseph X. Gravitt, a military veteran who became captain of the Fruit of Islam, the nation's paramilitary security force, or Louis I, who Malcolm mentored into becoming the minister at the Boston Temple. Louis was one of Malcolm's most trusted allies, driven by genuine belief and profound respect for his mentor. The irony is delicious. Louis I would later become Louis Farrakhan, the man who would publicly call for Malcolm's death. Even Malcolm's own sister, Ella Mae Collins, rejoined the nation through the Boston Temple. Malcolm called her the most formidable person he knew after his father, and her conversion validated his work in ways that thousands of strangers never could. Under Malcolm's leadership, the nation modernized rapidly. While leadership was often dominated by Elijah Muhammad's family members, Malcolm emphasized talent and diligence as the key criteria for advancement. He was building something unprecedented, a black nationalist organization with both spiritual authority and practical power. At heart, Malcolm X was the perfect diplomat warrior. He could maintain engaging relationships with political rivals while projecting an image of uncompromising racial militancy. He was building an empire, but he was building it so well that it would soon threaten the very man who had created him. By 1964, Malcolm X had become something unprecedented in American history, a black leader whose influence extended far beyond America's borders. And that's when the Nation of Islam realized they had created a monster they could no longer control. John Lewis, the future congressman who was then a leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, experienced Malcolm's international impact firsthand during his travels through Africa. Everywhere Lewis went, the question was the same. What's your organization's relationship with Malcolm's? Think about what this means. African freedom fighters, independence leaders, intellectuals, they weren't asking about Martin Luther King Jr. or the NAACP. They were asking about Malcolm X. Lewis realized that unless SNCC was perceived as being equally radical as Malcolm, they wouldn't capture the full attention of Africans who were inspired by Malcolm's presence and message. Lewis documented this in his SNCC report. Malcolm's impact on Africa was just fantastic. In every African country, Malcolm had become the benchmark for measuring the political authenticity of other African Americans. But here's where the story gets really interesting. During a chance meeting at a cafe in Nairobi, Kenya, Lewis encountered Malcolm, who was clearly buoyed by the positive reception he was receiving from people of all backgrounds: blacks, whites, Asians, and Arabs. This international embrace was fostering Malcolm's belief in the potential for unity among diverse peoples. But Malcolm shared something chilling with the SNCC group. He was certain he was being watched and followed, convinced that someone wanted to harm him. This meeting in Kenya would be the last time John Lewis saw Malcolm X alive. Malcolm's travels extended far beyond his original 6-week plan, stretching into an 18-week pilgrimage that would fundamentally transform his worldview. But while Malcolm was experiencing spiritual growth and international acclaim, back home, the Nation of Islam was planning his destruction. When Malcolm X returned to New York on November 24, 1964, he walked into a trap that had been carefully set during his absence. The December 4th issue of Muhammad Speaks, the very newspaper Malcolm had helped create, contained a vehement attack that would seal his fate. The author of this attack wasn't some unknown NOI official. It was Minister Louis X of Boston, Malcolm's own protege, the man he had mentored and trusted above almost all others. Louis X branded his former mentor as an international hobo and issued a statement that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who reads it. The die is set, and Malcolm shall not escape, especially after such evil, foolish talk about his benefactor, Elijah Muhammad, in trying to rob him of the divine glory which Allah had bestowed upon him. Such a man as Malcolm is worthy of death, and would have met with death if it had not been for Muhammad's confidence in Allah for victory over his enemies. This wasn't just criticism, this was a public death sentence issued by Malcolm's own spiritual son. But what had Malcolm done to deserve such treatment? The answer lies in his transformation during those 18 weeks abroad. Malcolm's experience of true Islam during his pilgrimage to Mecca had shattered the racial theology of the Nation of Islam. He had prayed alongside white Muslims, experienced genuine brotherhood across racial lines, and come to understand that the nation's teachings were a distortion of true Islamic faith. Even more dangerously, Malcolm had begun speaking publicly about Elijah Muhammad's moral failures. While maintaining his critique of American racial injustices, Malcolm was now advocating for a more inclusive approach that emphasized racial cooperation and universal human dignity. This theological evolution wasn't just a spiritual matter, it was an existential threat to the Nation of Islam's entire worldview and power structure. Malcolm X, the man who had built their empire, was now positioned to tear it down from the inside. Nothing destroys a religious movement faster than the moral failure of its prophet. And Malcolm X was about to expose secrets that would shatter the Nation of Islam's carefully constructed mythology around Elijah Muhammad. The story begins with whispers and rumors, but Malcolm had evidence. Elijah Muhammad, the self-proclaimed messenger of Allah, had been engaging in extramarital relationships with multiple women, many of them his young secretaries. 6 of these women had become pregnant by Muhammad. For Malcolm, this wasn't just moral hypocrisy. It was a complete betrayal of everything the nation claimed to represent. The organization preached strict moral codes, demanded celibacy from its ministers, and positioned Muhammad as a divine messenger above human weakness. Malcolm's response was methodical and devastating. He sent his chief aide, James 67 X Shabazz, to Phoenix to obtain signatures for a paternity lawsuit from 2 former secretaries, Lucille Rosary and Evelyn Williams, who had once been Malcolm's own girlfriend. This case was passed to attorney Gladys Towles Root in Los Angeles. But Malcolm didn't stop with behind-the-scenes legal maneuvering. He took the scandal public, first during an interview with Mike Wallace on CBS, then later in court during his own eviction trial. The Nation of Islam's response was swift and desperate. NOI officials John Ali and Raymond Sharif, along with 5 women, 3 of whom were allegedly involved with Muhammad, held a press conference to counter Malcolm's accusations. They were joined by Dolores Jardine, the widow of Ronald Stokes, voicing support for Muhammad. This wasn't just a he said, she said controversy. This was warfare between a man who had given everything to build an organization and the organization that now saw him as its greatest threat. Just days before his assassination, Malcolm met with attorney Root, as well as Rosary and Williams, providing them with critical information and agreeing to testify in the upcoming trial. After Malcolm's assassination, the momentum on the lawsuit mysteriously dissipated. The paternity scandals revealed the complete breakdown of what Malcolm had once described as a father-son relationship between himself and Elijah Muhammad. The man Malcolm had revered as a divine messenger was exposed as deeply flawed, and Malcolm's refusal to remain silent about these flaws had signed his death warrant. The most heartbreaking betrayal in Malcolm X's final year didn't come from Elijah Muhammad or the nation's leadership. It came from the young man he had mentored like a son, Cassius Clay, soon to be known as Muhammad Ali. Their relationship had begun in 1961 when the brash young boxer introduced himself to Malcolm at Mosque No. 2 in Chicago. Clay and his brother Rudy had traveled from Louisville to hear Elijah Muhammad speak, and Malcolm saw something special in this confident young fighter. By January 1964, when Malcolm was under a 90-day silencing by the nation, he was invited to join Clay's boxing camp in Miami as an advisor. Clay was preparing to face Sonny Liston, and almost no one believed the 22-year-old had a chance against the formidable defending champion. For Malcolm, this was more than sports mentorship. It was a potential path back to relevance within the nation. Malcolm told Clay that his victory had been foretold centuries earlier, that it would signify not just a personal triumph, but a monumental victory for the Nation of Islam and the 700 million Muslims worldwide. Malcolm made a desperate bargain with NOI headquarters in Chicago. If Clay won, Malcolm would bring him to the annual Savior's Day convention in exchange for his reinstatement in the nation. The offer was rebuffed. They were skeptical of Clay's chances and unwilling to allow Malcolm back into the fold. But Malcolm's faith proved prophetic. Clay stunned the world by defeating Liston, and Malcolm was there at ringside, filled with profound satisfaction. He hosted a victory party at the Hampton House Motel, featuring bowls of ice cream in keeping with the nation's sober image. However, Clay's unexpected victory created a new problem for the nation's leadership. Now they had a valuable asset who viewed Malcolm as his primary mentor. When Clay visited New York City in March, staying at the Hotel Teresa and immediately reaching out to Malcolm, the alarm bells went off in Chicago. Malcolm capitalized on Clay's heightened visibility taking him to tour the United Nations and showing him potential homes in Queens. The press reported rumors of a new organization being formed by the duo to rival the Nation of Islam. For the Chicago leadership, the situation was clear. Clay was an invaluable asset who needed to be retained, while Malcolm X was a formidable adversary who posed a significant threat to their power structure. The final blow came during an unexpected encounter in Ghana. When Malcolm approached Clay, hoping to reconnect with his former protege, Ali publicly disavowed him, demonstrating his loyalty to Elijah Muhammad. Man, he's gone. He's gone so far out, he's out completely. Malcolm X, the man who had predicted Clay's victory, who had guided him through his transformation into Muhammad Ali, who had been like a father figure to the young champion, was cast aside like a stranger. The betrayal was complete. By March 1964, the Nation of Islam wasn't just trying to silence Malcolm X. They were trying to erase him entirely. The legal warfare began with something as mundane as a house, but it represented something much deeper: the complete dissolution of Malcolm's identity within the organization he had built. Elijah Muhammad's inquiry into the ownership of Malcolm's residence in Queens wasn't casual curiosity. It was the opening move in a calculated campaign to strip Malcolm of everything. Shortly after Malcolm announced the formation of Muslim Mosque, Inkorawina Maceo X. Owens, the secretary from Mosque No. 7, submitted legal documents to evict Malcolm and his family from their home. Think about the psychological warfare involved here. This wasn't just about property. It was about making Malcolm homeless, making him vulnerable, reminding him that everything he thought he owned actually belonged to the organization he had served. The nation's argument was coldly logical. The house had been purchased for Malcolm due to his ministerial role within the organization. With the formation of his independent mosque, he had effectively terminated that role. Malcolm countered that he hadn't been subjected to a proper trial according to NOI procedures, but the nation had moved beyond their own rules. The eviction trial on June 15th to 16th, 1964, was a circus of tension and barely contained violence. Malcolm arrived with 10 followers and 32 police officers for protection, while around 50 members of the Fruit of Islam looked on ominously. But Malcolm turned the courtroom into his final pulpit. Despite his attorney Percy Sutton's attempts to avoid raising sensitive issues, Malcolm was determined to expose everything. When questioned about his controversial statements, Malcolm revealed that his suspension wasn't really about his comments on President Kennedy's assassination. It was about something private, very private. With prominent NOI figures present in the courtroom, Malcolm dropped his bombshell. Elijah Muhammad had engaged with 9 women, 6 of whom became pregnant, and Malcolm's suspension was a result of sharing this sensitive information with high-ranking officials and ministers. This wasn't just testimony, it was declaration of war. Malcolm was using the civil court system to expose the religious corruption of the Nation of Islam's leadership. The ruling came in September 1964, favoring the Nation of Islam, but execution of the eviction was postponed until January 1965. Malcolm and his family received their eviction notice just before his assassination, relocating to a friend's house merely 3 days before his death. The legal battles weren't really about property or money. They were about power, control, and the dangerous consequences of challenging an organization that viewed dissent as treason. We finish this journey with a hard truth. Malcolm X's rise was powered by an organization that could not bear his transformation. What began as a platform for a fiery voice became a leash when he chose truth over loyalty. His pilgrimage to Mecca reshaped him, from separatist firebrand to a voice for shared humanity, and that evolution made him a threat. Betrayals, public condemnations, and legal attacks followed. The nation that built him moved to destroy him. If you take one thing away, let it be this: courage sometimes means leaving the movement when it stops moving toward justice. Want the full uncut story and the rare moments we couldn't fit here? Download the Scoob app now to get access to the full episode and exclusive extras. Thanks for listening, keep questioning, keep growing.